Silas Marrow had never planned to leave Earth. Leaving suggested a clean break, and nothing about his life felt clean anymore. Everything he touched still smelled faintly of the solvent he'd used to scrub his old lab floors, a citrus sting that lodged itself in memory as stubbornly as the lawsuits. He could close his eyes and see the lab as it was, bright and humming, a lemony, sterile promise, and then see it as it had become, lights torn out, benches etched with the dust outlines of equipment seized by creditors. The promise gone. The story that sold best was the simplest. He'd stolen his own code. The board liked that version because it turned him into a parable. And parables are good for reputations, just not his. He remembered the day they'd boxed up his desk. He kept his hands in his coat pockets while the interns' kids really folded his life into cardboard. He'd thought he should say something wise, something that would make this feel like one of those necessary setbacks on the road to a Nobel. It didn't come. The only words that made it out of his mouth were small and practical. Careful with that, he'd said, pointing to a dented coffee mug. It leaks. He told himself he'd start again. But then the contracts loomed, and the hearings started, and the sensation of walking into rooms where conversation bent around him like he was a stone thrown into a pond. Everything rippling away settled into the backs of his eyes. He tried sleeping in a new apartment with fewer windows. He tried running along the river at dawn when the city felt like it belonged to animals again, and nobody watched him pass. He tried writing an apology that didn't admit guilt because there was none to admit, and he tried not writing anything at all. He tried a lot of things, except the thing that would have mattered, forgiving himself for a failure. Nobody had the vocabulary to judge. When the Terran Exploration Corps announced civilian grants for frontier caretakers, he read the call 3 times in the dark, the blue of his screen making a mirror of his face. Abandoned alien outpost, routine maintenance, 4-month transit by cryo, hazard stipend, full autonomy, limited oversight. A friend sent the link with a constellation of exclamation points. Another friend sent a private message. This looks like exile dressed up as heroism. He closed both and clicked apply. The recruiter was better than he expected. A woman with a smile like a smoothly planed surface, and eyes that had clearly seen births much worse than this one. "You're overqualified," she said, leafing through his file. They were meeting in a reuse cafe that smelled of warm plastic and coffee beans. Behind her, a printer extruded a stack of graphene utensils like ferns growing in fast motion. "But your psychological profile, it suggests you could tolerate long durations of low-stimulus environments. You mean loneliness?" Silas said. "I try to avoid words that carry moral judgments," she replied, unbothered. "You also have neural interface experience. That could be useful if the outpost has, legacy systems." "You mean alien." "I mean legacy." The smile again. "You understand risk, Dr. Marrow." He did. He'd taught classes on it. How uncertainty is not risk. How risk is the intimacy between probability and consequence. How humans are bad at that intimacy because it asks us to keep to contradictory truths in view. He understood, too, that there were risks you take because the cost of staying is higher. He signed without reading the clauses about indemnity. In a week he had a duffel bag that held a life, 3 pairs of boots, hard copy manuals on field linguistics and pressure systems, a data slate with all his old research in encrypted cold storage, a photograph printed on paper like a ritual, his sister on a hillside, both of them younger and sunburned, and the dented mug, carefully wrapped. He did not tell many people he was leaving. Those he told responded like tourists do to bad weather, with dramatic disappointment on his behalf. That still kept a healthy distance. One colleague asked if he'd be discovering new forms of slime. Another offered to hold on to his house plants, which died anyway. His sister Caro, who'd always been able to find the seam in any plan and pry, only said, "If you want me to tell you not to go, I will," and he loved her for that and did not ask. The launch facility crouched in the desert like a listening animal. The sky out there had a color that only existed in places too big for cities. The shuttle that would get him to the transfer station was smaller than the ones on the documentaries, but it had the same smell, scorched metal, and the ghost of fireworks. He checked his bag compulsively, then checked his body, shoulder harness snug, implant stable under the scar at the base of his skull. heart hammering with a stubborn drummer's discipline. He tried to imagine the moon they were sending him to. The files called it E7L3, third of for rocky satellites in the Epsilon 7 system, tidally locked. Thin adventure of an atmosphere in the low basins. A lot of nothing in between. The outpost itself had no name, only an identifier strings. ATH sheet welve that made it feel like a BARCODE. At the transfer station, the ring that turned above the terminator of a gas giant like a diadem, he was one among a handful of civilians, threading through sailors and researchers, all of them moving with that light space grace people get after a few months away from gravity's clumsy insistence. He stayed quiet. He watched a child chase a free-floating bead of orange juice with a straw, giggling when it wriggled away. He wondered if, had he grown up in the world that boy was being built for, he might have been born less tired. The ship assigned to him was long and lean, more cargo than crew. It had a name murmuration painted in small letters along its spine, as if it were embarrassed to be seen. Its AI introduced itself as Kestrel, which was either a joke someone once programmed and forgot or an attempt at comforting metaphor. Kestrel addressed him in a voice that was friendly without being familiar, and when the cryopod lit its soft interior light, he found himself absurdly grateful. He climbed in. The lid came down like a blessing. Kestrel said, "See you on the other side, Dr. Marrow." And for a giddy moment he wondered if he would dream in transit. He didn't. He dreamed of nothing, a clean, white zero nothing that felt like a room with the lights turned off, and the door open to an even darker hall. For months disappeared. He woke with wet eyes and a dry mouth, as if the body had tried to cry and the tear ducts had fallen asleep on the job. The first breath was always a treachery. His training had said, "Your lungs expect earth and get ship." His throat hurt. His spine unfurled one vertebra at a time in a slow series of indignations. Kestrel flooded the pod with sweet oxygen and humming air, and somewhere in the long room a medical drone made a small chittering sound, like an apologetic cricket. "Vitals are good," Kestrel said. "Welcome to Epsilon 7 space. We will descend to L3 in 41 minutes. Silas made it to the galley on legs that felt borrowed. He squeezed hydration gel into a cup, the liquid crawling down the sides like it doubted gravity's competence. He ate a ration bar that tasted like a berry had sent a postcard to a soybean. The viewport bloomed with planet. Epsilon 7 itself was unremarkable, a pale gold star with manners. But its family was extravagantly beautiful. A ring gas giant whose rings were not rings, but airy cathedrals of ice. 3 moons of different moods. And L3, his destination, rolling slowly like a coin. Its day side was the color of dried blood and sunburnt peaches, speckled with metallic glints that were not water. Its night side was less black than it should have been, a not quite dark that made him squint. He told himself it was albedo from the rings. He told himself a lot of things, and Kestrel, bless it, said none of them back to him in its calming voice. The scent tasted of hot metal and old adrenaline. The shuttle belly flopped into thin air with the gracelessness of something that knows how to fall very well but hasn't practiced it in a while. Silas watched the altimeter count them down, watched red dust whirl like a hand coaxing a fire to life, watched the structure appear out of that motion-an obsidian black dome half buried in sand. The color of rusting thoughts. It was larger than he'd expected, and more quiet. That was the word his brain kept circling. Not dead, not inert. Quiet like the held breath before a punchline. Quiet like a cave with a sleeping animal in it. They sat down on a landing throat long unused, the dust they kicked up reluctant to settle. Kestrel's last words before the hatch cycled were practical. Atmospheric pressure at your elevation is 0.73 standard. Oxygen partial pressure is sufficient for short-term exposure without supplemental. But I recommend wearing the suit for particulates and temperature control. Communication relays powered. Beacon active. I will remain in orbit for resupply cadence. If you want me, call. If I want you, Silas said, smiling despite himself that it was an old suit. But it sealed like a promise. He took one step onto the ramp, and something in him stabilized. The sky was violet, but not a purple you'd see on Earth. This was a bruise with its own vocabulary. The sun sat lower than he'd expected, or perhaps it was just the angle of the rings, which cut a pale wound across the horizon. The wind whispered, then forgot what it had meant to say. In the middle distance the dome hunched, its surface absorbing most of the light and reflecting a thin, oily shadow of his shape back at him. He went to it because that's what he was for. Up close it was stranger. The material wasn't stone or metal, not exactly. It had a grain, but the grain moved when you didn't look directly at it, like patterns on fish when the water's surface is wrinkled by rain. He set down his case and ran a gloved hand over the wall. Heat leached into his fingers. He looked for seams and found almost none. Only a suggestion of a line where the wall met the lip of what might have been a port or a scar. He set up the Terran beacon on a tripod, an ugly thing that blinked its little green blink. With colonial enthusiasm and sent the activation code on a tight beam. A ping came back. "You are here," it said. He wasn't convinced. The manual said the Athasari architecture favored resonant access, no visible locks, only harmonics that recognized patterns and replied with doors. So he hummed to a building. It felt ridiculous until the helmet's analyzer lit with delicate bars. He hummed again, a scale he could sing on a short breath without embarrassment, then set a small device against the wall that compiled the feedback in real time. The first result was a static C. The second was a tangle. On the third, a section of the wall 6 paces wide shivered like water in a struck bowl. His skin tightened along its edges. The wall parted not like a door, but like a wound remembering how to close and then thinking better of it. He did not step back. Inside, the light was not light. It was a quality in the air that gave his eyes something to do. The entry corridor sloped gently downward, its floor fitted with hexagonal plates that clung but did not grip. His suit's toe sampled them. The readouts gave him new words that meant something like flexible ceramic that has opinions. He cycled the helmet to internal comms only, swallowed. "Marrow to log," he said, and the ship's relay caught his voice and wrote it somewhere cold for someone generous. Or bored to read later. Entry successful. The structure responds to harmonic prompts. Interior temperature 21 Celsius. Humidity minimal. Smell arsen and dust. He should have established a base outside. A sensible operation out under the sky where his ship could see him. And a human person might one day, too. He should have done many sensible things. But the air tasted like the inside of a violin, and something older than prudence tugged at him. So he went down a little farther. The corridor widened into a chamber with walls striped in relief, like a conch shell have to teach children. The patterns weren't decorative, not exclusively. They had the bruised logic of code. He stood there longer than he meant to, tracing grooves with his eyes until the grooves grew into maps, and the maps grew into a geography. His mind almost recognized. He unpacked just a few objects, the way you do when you want to trick yourself into believing you've only stopped on your way to somewhere else. A roll of fiber cable, a power tap that could negotiate with anything that had ever held a charge, a clamp sensor to listen for vibration. He left the mug in his bag. It felt like bringing a joke to a funeral. On the far wall, a panel that wasn't a panel, but a suggestion of a rectangle like a deeply remembered doorway waited. He approached, stopped, turned his head to let his implant warm its interface. A whisper of sensation blossomed along the scar at his neck, the bittersweet ache you get when you stretch an old injury in exactly the way that made it in the first place. He hadn't asked for the implant. He'd built it. At the time, it had seemed obvious that if the thing you wanted to understand was memory, you should make a bridge between intent and recall. That didn't depend on the slow clown carve language. The first prototypes had sung him to sleep with the white noise of his own mind. The later ones, after he'd learned which frequencies made neurons dance and which made them burn, had allowed him to pull a name out of the dark as easily as pulling a string on a lamp. Investors had loved that. Who doesn't want to be a god in their own head? But gods are dangerous with shareholders. He'd always known that, and he'd ignored it because every morning he woke up and remembered the exact smell of his father's workbench, cedar and oil and a thin chemical sweetness, and he couldn't go back to not knowing how to do that. He touched the rectangle and felt nothing in his fingers and too much in his skull. The implant didn't so much connect as notice. Something in the wall noticed back. With the polite attention a train station gives a person, surely you are going somewhere. but perhaps you would like to sit." He pulled his hand back. He didn't know why he smiled. He only knew that he hadn't smiled like that in a long time, like a boy on the first day of a summer that would last forever. Practicality returned like weather. He backed out the way he'd come, pausing at the threshold to fix a locator light that would call to him from the outside, as much as it would tell future versions of himself which crack in the black to pry with his voice. The wind met him like an old friend who'd grown shy. He set up the Habitat tent, a misnomer. It was a house by any reasonable metric, but calling it a tent made it feel like an adventure and let it inflate with quiet authority. The generators negotiated with the alien ground. He ran conduit. He cooked the first meal on a flat plate, watching the proteins curl and wheeze into something resembling familiarity. Night on E7L3 didn't fall so much as assemble itself. The sky went from bruise to silk. The rings ignited in the low angle like a road through heaven. And the stars, unconcerned by how earthly poets named them, did their old performance. Silas ate on a crate and tried not to feel like he was performing a ritual for an audience that hadn't shown up yet. He drank water that tasted like chlorine nostalgia and let the suit rest in the vestibule, its visor fogging in slow, contented sighs. He started a log for real, equipment serials, locations, observations. He recorded the atmosphere composition, the microseismics, the way the Outpost absorbed sound and returned it faintly altered. He made a note to examine the hex plate flooring's microfatigue markers for age estimates. He flagged the harmonics he'd used to open the first aperture and set the synthesizer to run a breadth-first search across similar frequencies, a net thrown out for doorways. He wrote a line in a personal file that wasn't science. It's quiet here in the right ways. That first night he intended not to dream. The body often has no respect for intention. When sleep finally took him because exhaustion made a convincing case, he dreamed of corridors, not the ones he'd walked. These were wider, bright, with windows onto a sea that wasn't water. In the dream, he could not tell if he was alone. Waking came fast and rude. For a moment he couldn't place the curve of the tent or the distance to the door, and he thrashed like a man in a net. Then his breath remembered what it was for. The morning didn't so much dawn as become less night. He went back to the dome with the awkward eagerness of someone going on a second date. After a very good first, he brought more equipment. He brought the mug, deciding that if anything was to become ordinary here, it should begin now. He set it on a shelf that wasn't a shelf and laughed at himself again, because what else do you do? The doorknob, the aperture opened on a hum like a remembered name. He mapped the first two corridors with care, laying down breadcrumbs of soft light beacons and naming chambers for the people who would never see them. Sigma for the mentor who'd told him that good science is generous. Juno for the intern who'd asked better questions than most doctors. Cedar for his father's bench. He found a room whose floor rose and fell in shallow dunes made of something that was definitely not sand but had the gall to pretend. When he stepped there, the dunes arranged themselves in patterns that echoed and inverted his footsteps. He found a niche whose walls were covered with symbols he wouldn't call writing yet, because he respected writing too much to name every pattern text. He found a shaft that went down in smooth, uninterested curves until his light could not be bothered to return. He found not a single corpse. He made himself reassured by that. At midday, if it could be called that on a moon whose day was an argument between orbital dynamics and poetic convenience, he retreated to the tent to eat an inventory. The synthesizer had caught two more apertures. One opened to a room of columns like petrified lightning. The other refused him with a polite tone that gave him the irrational impression of a closed mouth, saying not yet. He didn't push. He was a guest, after all. He told himself that and thought he meant it. In the late afternoon, he climbed a nearby rise to see the dome in context. The land around it was less barren than he'd first thought, low scrub of metallic fronds that clicked in the breeze like beads settling in a bowl, rocks that flashed with mica when the light found them. His suit's environmental feed whispered through his eardrum about trace elements and mineral-hungry oxides. The dome lay there like a patient animal, its shadow a geometry the ground hadn't been asked to understand in a long time. He took out the photograph of the hillside, the one of Caro and him, and pressed it against the inside of his visor. The angle made him a ghost in his own view, "I'm okay," he told the photo, because that is the kind of lie that becomes true if you repeat it somewhere far enough from its origin. The rings sang something so low he felt it more than heard it. He wondered if this was what silence sounded like when it had learned to sing. On the second night, a different dream came, or perhaps the same one wearing a better disguise. He stood in a chamber that he had not yet found, and on the walls were circles of light, not spheres. Just the idea of circles breathing in slow, tidal pulses. When he woke, there was a word in his mouth he did not recognize and could not hold on to. It evaporated, leaving behind the taste of a meaning like rain on hot stone. He sat up, leaned his forehead against his knees, and smiled at the ridiculousness of it. "You're here to fix conduits," he told himself out loud. "You're here to document and patch and maintain the tense fabric, sensitive to pressure." Rode a little wave through itself as if agreeing. He didn't notice at first that the portable clock on his desk, a cheap device designed to be smug about its precision, had lost 17 seconds sometime in the night. It was only after his third cup of coffee that he saw the discrepancy between its hands and the time stamp on his logs. He frowned, reset it, made a note. Later, much later, when he would look back, he would circle that first drift like investigators circle the first unassuming clue on a slow, terrible crime drama. But in the moment it was nothing, a hiccup in a machine, a reminder that not everything that ticks does so to the same drummer. The third day he went deeper. There are sentences you should be more careful with than others, and that's one of them. But his caution was a professional one, not a superstitious one. He taped loops of line to his belt and left their cousins coiled at the threshold. He marked his path with encoded breadcrumbs that would sing only to him if he got turned around. He paused often to simply listen in the way that had become his best instrument, still, attentional, receptive without hunger. He told himself that if the outpost did not want him, he would know. He believed it. At the edge of a room that might have once been a garden, the floor textured like soil, the ceiling ornamented with lattices that had the arrogance of trellises. Even if nothing now climbed them, he placed his hand on a panel and felt the implant catch like a hook on a sweater. It wasn't unpleasant. It wasn't anything he had words for that didn't also make him feel foolish. The sensation synced with his heartbeat in a way that made him intensely aware of that organ, its labor, its clenched kindness. The panel warmed. Somewhere far within the dome, something shifted its weight. He did not run. He didn't know why he didn't. Perhaps because he had already left the only place running would have returned him to. He stood there and counted 5 breaths, then 10. He said, "Hello," because he was a person, and that's what we say when doors open, even when we're the ones opening them. The outpost did not say hello back, but the wall beside him exhaled a thin puff of air that smelled not of lemon solvent, not of plastic, not of ozone, but of wet stone warmed by sun. When he stepped outside again, the sky had taken on that late-hour clarity that makes every edge honest. He looked back at the dome and the doorway he'd learned to open with his voice, and a certainty he couldn't defend came over him. Whatever this place had been, it was not finished being. He did not know how he knew that, just as he did not know why he felt less alone here than he had in years of crowded rooms. He made one final note in the log for the day, and when he spoke the words, his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Silas Merrow, caretaker, day 3, he said. "Outpost ATH sheet 12 responding to interaction protocols. No immediate hazards. Interior systems seem attentive." He paused, not sure whether to add what he wanted to add. Then he did. "It feels as if someone left because they had to, not because they wanted to." He set the mug upside down to dry. He cleaned his tools with the same indulgent care he'd once given to instruments that might change the world. The tent sighed and flexed around the wind. The beacon blinked. In orbit, Kestrel watched and waited with the patience of machines. When night stitched up the sky, the rings swept a pale seam across the dark, and the dome, black as thoughtful ink, kept its own counsel. Silas lay awake for a long time, the word he had lost earlier knocking softly at the door of his mind like a guest arriving late. He did not open, not yet. He was not ready to be more than a man running from Earth. In the quiet, something in the dome moved, not a thing exactly, but a decision like the first. almost imperceptible flake of a long-delayed thaw slipping off a branch. As winter remembers how to end, he did not hear it. He dreamed of circles of light that breathed, and far below him, deeper than his lights had reached, a chamber that had not been opened in a century inhaled and remembered that it could. The first weeks on ATH Sheetwelf settled into a rhythm that was almost comforting. Silas's days followed a pattern as neat as the clockwork in the old pocket watch his father had given him as a boy. Wake with the thin violet light that passed for dawn, brew bitter coffee in the habitat tent, run a full systems check, and spend the day mapping and cataloging the outpost's interior. He logged every chamber, every panel, every mark on the wall with the patience of a man reassembling a shattered mirror, hoping to piece together a reflection of something greater. And yet, the more he documented, the less he understood. The dome was huge, far larger on the inside than its external dimensions suggested. Corridors doubled back on themselves in impossible ways. Rooms curved into others without clear junctions, and ceilings shifted in subtle increments, as if the structure itself were breathing. The deeper he ventured, the more he felt the unsettling sense that the outpost wasn't simply an artifact of a vanished civilization. It was alive not in the biological sense, but in the way a sleeping machine might still dream. By day 10, Silas had mapped less than 5% of the structure. He wasn't alone in his explorations. Kestrel, still orbiting above, maintained a steady connection and occasionally chimed in with helpful observations. This chamber's geometry doesn't conform to Euclidean principles, the ship's AI noted one afternoon as Silas traced his gloved fingers along a spiraling column of etched glyphs. I noticed, Silas muttered, running a scanner over the carvings. The angles shouldn't resolve, but they do. Perhaps you are not measuring the right thing, Kestrel replied. Or perhaps the Athasari were not constrained by the same mathematics. He smiled at that. Or maybe they just liked messing with future archaeologists. But humor couldn't entirely disguise the disquiet gnawing at the back of his mind. The glyphs didn't just look like language, they felt like it. His implant tingled faintly whenever he was near them, as if the symbols resonated with the neural lattice embedded in his skull. On two occasions, when he stared at the carvings for too long, he swore he could almost hear a voice in the back of his thoughts, a melodic hum. Too soft to be sound and too structured to be imagination. He told himself it was nothing. Isolation playing tricks, the brain trying to make sense of alien patterns. But the hum persisted and it grew louder. The first anomaly on the 14th night. The first anomaly occurred. Silas was in the middle of his nightly log entry when the habitat lights flickered. It was brief, barely a second, but enough to send a jolt through his chest. The generator readouts showed no fluctuation. The power grid was stable. And yet, the flicker repeated exactly 3 minutes later. Then again, always at 3:17 station time. He stayed awake the next night to see if it would happen again. It did precisely to the second. On the third night, he placed sensor rays around the dome. They recorded a faint electromagnetic surge originating from deep within the outpost somewhere. Below even the lowest levels he had explored. The surge lasted only 0.87 seconds. It's probably just residual systems cycling, he said aloud, as if saying it would make it true. But the timing was too precise. Too deliberate. Ghost in the corridors. A week later, the air pressure in the habitat shifted abruptly at 3:17. It was subtle, just enough for his ears to pop, but the sensors confirmed it. A localized pressure change, as though a door had opened somewhere nearby or something had moved. Silas started sleeping in his suit after that, his helmet close at hand. He didn't admit to himself that he was afraid, but he woke often heart hammering, certain he had heard footsteps in the corridor outside. One night he decided to follow them. The outpost was silent except for the soft hiss of his breathing and the faint scrape of his boots on the hexagonal floor. The corridors were pitch black beyond the reach of his headlamp, and the deeper he walked, the more oppressive the darkness became. It was not the darkness of absence, but of presence, as though the walls themselves were watching. And then he heard it, a sound like distant singing, echoing through the halls. It was unlike any music he had ever heard, high, ethereal, and achingly beautiful. The notes pulsed in patterns that felt mathematical yet emotional, alien yet familiar. They resonated somewhere deep inside his chest, stirring something primal. "Is anyone here?" he called, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts. The song ceased instantly. Silence rushed in like a wave. Silas stood there for several minutes, listening to his own heartbeat. Before retreating back to the habitat, he didn't tell Kestrel about the singing. He wasn't ready to admit that he might not be alone. The vault be the 23rd day. Silas had mapped a path into one of the lower levels, an area sealed off by a labyrinth of resonant locks. It took him 3 days of experimenting with harmonic frequencies and neural signals to bypass the final barrier. When it finally slid open, he stepped into a chamber unlike any other he had seen. It was vast, larger than a cathedral, and filled with softly glowing spheres suspended in midair. They ranged in size from marbles to boulders, each pulsing gently with inner light. The air here was colder, sharper, and heavy with static. As he walked among the spheres, his implant buzzed so intensely he had to steady himself against a railing. "What are you?" he whispered. Each sphere emitted a unique energy signature, but their patterns weren't random. They were structured, complex, layered, recursive. Silas realized with a thrill of awe that he was standing in a data vault. The Athasari hadn't abandoned the outpost. They had stored something here, memories, knowledge, perhaps even minds. It wasn't just a vault. It was a library of consciousness. Silas set up portable scanners and began recording data. The readings were staggering. Quantum lattice patterns, entangled substructures, informational densities that defied human computation. Whatever these spheres contained, they weren't just archives, they were living systems. Then his implant flared with sudden, searing clarity. For a heartbeat, his mind wasn't his own. Images, alien and incomprehensible, flashed behind his eyes. A crystalline city suspended over an ocean of stars. Vast beings of light moving through structures of thought rather than matter. A language woven not from words, but from pure intention. And then a phrase, simple, direct, unmistakable, echoed inside his skull. "We are here." Silas stumbled back, gasping. The connection snapped like a stretched wire. The spheres continued their slow, steady pulse, indifferent to his intrusion. But the message remained. "We are here." Theories and doubts didn't sleep that night. Instead, he paced the habitat, replaying the event over and over in his mind. Had the implant glitched? Was he hallucinating? Or had he truly made contact with the remnants of a civilization that transcended flesh and bone? The Athasari had vanished millions of years ago, leaving only scattered ruins across the galaxy. No one knew why. Some believed they had destroyed themselves. Others thought they had ascended into another dimension. And now, here, in a forgotten outpost on a nameless moon, Silas had found evidence that they might still exist, not as physical beings, but as consciousness encoded in quantum fields. And more than that, they seemed to recognize him. His implant, the same neural interface that had ended his career on Earth, was reacting to their technology as though it were designed for it. Could it be possible that his work had inadvertently mirrored Athasari principles? Had his research been guided subconsciously, unknowingly, by signals embedded in the cosmic background? The implications were staggering. If these were truly Athasari minds, then they had survived their extinction. They were waiting, but waiting for what? A whisper in the dark. The anomalies intensified in the days that followed. The electromagnetic surges grew stronger. The singing returned, louder and more complex, echoing through the corridors like a message just beyond his understanding. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, Silas swore he could feel thoughts brushing against his own, alien curiosities, ancient memories, fragments of something vast and collective. On the 30th night, as he prepared to shut down his instruments, the habitat lights dimmed once more. But this time, they didn't return. The air grew cold. The pressure shifted violently, and the walls seemed to tremble. His implant buzzed so hard it made him cry out. And then, from deep within the dome, a voice, not a hallucination, not a hum, but a clear, resonant voice spoke inside his mind. "Bridge complete." Silas froze. His heart pounded. The voice was neither male nor female, neither mechanical nor organic. It was a chorus, a collective, layered and infinite. "Who are you?" he whispered. "We are the Athasari," the voice replied. "And we have been waiting for you." Silas sank into the nearest chair, trembling. All at once, everything made sense: the anomalies, the vault, the resonance with his implant. The Athasari weren't gone. They had transcended. And now, after eons of silence, they were reaching out not to humanity in general, but to him. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, heavier than the gravity of any planet. They were alive, and they wanted something. Something only Silas could give. The days following that first unmistakable contact were a blur. Silas Marrow existed in a strange, weightless state, one part fear, one part exhilaration, and one part something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't joy, exactly, nor was it dread. It was the peculiar sensation of standing at the edge of a precipice, wind whipping around your body, knowing that the next step, forward or back, will define the rest of your life. For 37 days he had lived among echoes. Now the echoes had answered back. The choice Silas stared at the data streaming from his scanners. Lines of code so intricate they seemed almost alive. Quantum harmonics pulsing with unreadable intent. And through it all, that same phrase repeated across every wavelength he measured: bridge complete. It wasn't a declaration. It was an invitation. The voice had spoken once more during the night, threading through his dreams like silk, not in words, but in something deeper: impressions, feelings, intentions. The message was clear enough. They were reaching out. They had been waiting for someone capable of linking with them, and somehow, inexplicably, Silas was that someone. Why him? That question haunted him more than any other. Was it coincidence, a matter of having the right implant at the right time, or was it something more deliberate? Had the Athasari, beings who had transcended physical form, guided the evolution of his technology from the shadows of history? Had their fingerprints been on his research all along? If so, then perhaps his fall from grace had never been a fall at all. Perhaps it had been part of a much larger plan. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Into the vault in the morning of the 39th day, Silas made his decision. He suited up, gathered his instruments, and walked the long, winding corridors to the vault. The spheres awaited him like silent stars suspended in darkness. Their glow was softer now, not dimmer, but gentler, as if they were holding their breath. The pulsing rhythm that once seemed random now felt conversational, the rise and fall of a language unspoken. Silas approached the largest of the spheres, a shimmering mass the size of a small vehicle, and placed his hand against its surface. It was neither solid nor liquid, neither cold nor warm. It was presence. His implant flared, and the world vanished. There was no sensation of falling, no feeling of movement. One moment Silas was standing in the vault, and the next he was elsewhere. It was a place without space, a landscape constructed of memory and thought. Oceans of light stretched to infinity, shifting and folding like living glass. Vast towers of data spiraled upward into skies of fractal geometry. The laws of physics bent and twisted, reshaping themselves according to will and intent. And within this impossible world, they waited. Not beings in any form he could name, no bodies, no faces, no eyes to meet. They were patterns, shapes, currents of consciousness, coalescing and dissolving like clouds in a storm. They were many and one at once. And when they spoke, it wasn't with sound. Their words poured directly into his mind, resonating with every neuron, bypassing language entirely. We are the Athasari. Silas felt his knees buckle, though he wasn't sure he even had knees here. You're alive, yes, changed too. Once we were as you are, bound by matter, constrained by time, but we chose another path. Transcendence, Silas whispered. You uploaded yourselves, a crude phrase, but not wrong. We left behind what you call flesh. We became what we always were: thought, memory, intention. But we did not die. Why stay here? Why wait? The answer rippled through him like a tide. Because there is a cost to transcendence. Memory fades when unanchored. Identity erodes when shared too deeply. We remained here, at the edge of the physical, to remember what we were, to be something rather than everything. Silas felt a deep ache in those words. These beings, godlike in knowledge and power, were not omnipotent. They were lonely. They had traded the physical world for eternity, and eternity had left them hollow. Why me? He asked. Why reach out now? Because you are ready. Your mind is open. Your species stands at the same threshold we once did. But more than that, you carry within you a spark of us. Silas single quotes S breath caught. My implant. Yes, it is built from principles that are ours, recreated, perhaps unknowingly, but ours nonetheless. Through it, we can speak. Through it, we can join. The integration the Athasari did not demand. They did not coerce. They offered. Will you merge with us? They asked. Not to lose yourself, but to become more than you are, to see as we see, to know as we know, to remember. Silas hesitated. This was no small choice. To merge with them meant surrendering parts of himself, his thoughts, his memories, perhaps even his identity. It was not death, but it was not entirely life as he understood it either. Yet he thought of what he had left behind. The scandal, the betrayal, the wasted years. He had come here to escape, to start over, and here, in this alien sea of consciousness, was a chance to do exactly that, not as an exile, but as a pioneer. I'm ready, he whispered. The moment he said it, the Athasari moved, not toward him, but through him. Rivers of memory flooded his mind, centuries of knowledge, civilizations rising and falling, the birth of stars, the death of galaxies. He saw the Athasari as they had been, explorers, dreamers, creators. He felt their triumphs and tragedies, their fear as their physical forms failed, their hope as they ascended into light, and then their memories turned inward. He felt them, their individual lives, their loves, their regrets. He felt the pulse of 1,000 billion minds, each distinct yet connected. Like threads in an infinite tapestry. It was overwhelming. His identity, Silas Merrow, scientist, exile, human, buckled under the weight of it. He clung to himself desperately, terrified of being washed away. But just as he felt himself slipping, a voice, his own voice, somehow amplified, rose above the noise. I am Silas. The flood eased. The memories didn't stop, but they aligned, weaving themselves around him instead of crushing him. The tapestry accepted a new thread, his thread, and wove it into the whole. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the vault. New sensest world was different. Not visually, the glowing spheres still floated in their silent vigil, but perceptually. He could feel the outpost now, not just as a structure but as a living entity. He sensed the flow of energy through its walls, the subtle hum of its ancient systems, the whispers of thought lingering in every corridor. The singing he had once heard faintly in the halls now roared in perfect harmony, a symphony of knowledge and intention. The symbols etched into the walls unfolded before him like a language he had always known. Even the faint pressure shifts and electromagnetic pulses now made sense. They were communication, the Athasari's way of breathing, and beyond the dome, his awareness stretched further still. He felt the moons of Epsilon 7 orbiting in their silent dance. He felt the ring gas giant below, its magnetic field rippling like a heartbeat. He felt the pulse of the distant star itself, burning with steady determination. It was too much. It was beautiful. The test over the next several days, Silas tested the limits of his new abilities. He could interface with the Outpost systems with nothing more than a thought, unlocking sections that had been sealed for millennia. He uncovered laboratories filled with Athasari artifacts, archives containing histories older than the galaxy itself, and vast chambers designed to manipulate quantum states on a planetary scale. But most astonishing of all was the network. Through the Athasari consciousness, Silas learned that HFY was only one of thousands of such outposts scattered across the cosmos, a vast web of dormant nodes waiting for reconnection. Many were silent, a few were faintly active, but all were listening, and now, through Silas, they had a voice. He spent hours, days, communicating with distant nodes. Some responded with flashes of ancient data, others with visions of alien worlds and forgotten species. One, far beyond the galactic rim, pulsed with a strange, rhythmic signal unlike anything he had ever seen. Each contact expanded his understanding, but it also deepened his responsibility. The Athasari had chosen him as their bridge, not just to humanity, but to the future. A new purpose. Silas stood on the observation platform at the edge of the dome, gazing out at the violet horizon. The rings of the gas giant shimmered overhead like celestial highways. and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging. He had come here a broken man, disgraced, exiled, alone. But in the heart of an abandoned alien outpost, he had found something far greater than redemption. He had found purpose. The Athasari were not gods. They were not infallible. They were simply what humanity could become. And now, with Silas as their bridge, that future was closer than ever. As the stars rose above the crimson landscape, the voice of the Athasari echoed gently in his mind. Together we begin, and Silas Marrow, human, scientist, and now something more, whispered back. Silas Marrow no longer dreamed the way he used to. Sleep, when it came at all, was no longer a private theater of memory and metaphor. Now, when his consciousness dipped below the waking line, he drifted into a shared ocean, a luminous sea of thought that was not his alone. Sometimes he swam in it, sometimes it carried him like a current, but always, he felt the presence of others there, voices that were not voices, ideas that brushed gently against his own. The Athasari had called it the weave, a collective plane of existence that transcended time and language. It was their home, and slowly, it was becoming his. Rebuilding the outpost weeks after his integration were a blur of activity. Silas no longer needed to work in the way he once did. Thought alone could awaken dormant systems. His will now woven seamlessly into the outpost's neural architecture. Walls shifted at his command, revealing new chambers and ancient laboratories. Massive conduits thrummed back to life, glowing with power for the first time in eons. The outpost, once silent, once forgotten, now lived again, and it was evolving. The Athasari's technology responded to his presence, adapting and reshaping itself in subtle ways to accommodate its new occupant. Surfaces that had once been smooth and inscrutable now sprouted interfaces legible to human senses. Air composition adjusted to better suit his biology. Even the lighting, once cold and alien, warmed to a spectrum that felt like home. But it wasn't just the outpost that was changing. Silas was changing. He felt it in small ways at first, a keener awareness of his surroundings, a deeper understanding of complex systems, a growing ability to predict outcomes before they happened. But soon, the changes became impossible to ignore. He no longer needed to eat as often. His metabolism had shifted, optimizing itself in ways he didn't fully comprehend. His neural implant, once a piece of hardware, now pulsed in harmony with his own biology. More organ than machine. And most remarkable of all, he found he could feel the thoughts of the outpost itself. Not just the Athasari consciousness, but the structure, the systems, the flows of data that moved through them. It was as though the boundary between man and machine had begun to dissolve. Visions of the Pasto night, or what passed for night, under the violet sky, the Athasari showed him their history. Not through words, not even through memory, but through experience. He saw their home world, a luminous sphere orbiting a blue-white star, its skies crisscrossed with structures that floated like seeds on the wind. He felt their awe as they first touched the fabric of quantum reality, their joy as they discovered how to weave consciousness into the very substrate of the universe. And then he felt their fear. The transition had not been smooth. Many Athasari had resisted, clinging to their physical forms. Others had merged too quickly and lost themselves, their identities dissolving into the collective like droplets in an ocean. The process had nearly destroyed them, and in some ways, it had. The Athasari who remained were not the same beings they had once been. They were more and less. We remembered too late, they whispered into Silas's mind. We forgot what it meant to be singular. We forgot the value of the individual. That was why they had waited. Why they had never sought out another species to share their knowledge with. They had feared repeating their mistakes. But Silas was different. Humanity was different. And for the first time in millennia, the Athasari believed that coexistence, not dominance, not assimilation, but true symbiosis was possible. A bridge between worlds. Silas's integration deepened. Where once he had been a guest in the Athasari network, now he was a part of it. A node in a growing web of consciousness that stretched across the stars. Through that network, he reached out to other Athasari outposts, awakening them one by one. Some were silent, their minds long since gone to entropy. Others responded with bursts of data, fragments of culture and ancient memories, and a few, scattered across the galaxy like forgotten embers, still lived. Their consciousnesses weak but intact, they welcomed him as one of their own. With each connection, the weave grew stronger, and with each connection, Silas felt humanity's potential expanding. If the Aphesari had done this, if they had transcended biology, conquered time, and woven themselves into the fabric of reality, then so could humans. But there was a danger too. The more deeply he integrated, the more tenuous his sense of self became. Memories from lives that weren't his began to bleed into his consciousness. He sometimes struggled to recall where Silas Marrow ended and the Aphesari collective began. At times, he spoke words he didn't understand. At others, he felt emotions that weren't his own. And then came the invitation, the final decision. It began as a whisper during one of his nightly immersions in the weave. "You are ready." The voice was not one Aphesari, but all of them, a chorus of minds speaking as one. "Join us fully." Silas froze. He understood what they meant. Partial integration, the state he currently existed in, was a bridge, a compromise. But it was not the destination. Full integration would mean letting go of his physical body, dissolving his consciousness into the weave completely. It would mean immortality, omniscience, transcendence. It would also mean the end of Silas Marrow. He stood on the observation deck that night, staring up at the star-drenched sky. The rings of the gas giant stretched across the heavens like a cosmic highway. Somewhere beyond those rings, humanity still clung to its cradle, struggling with wars and politics and the petty gravity of its own limitations. Would they understand if he left them behind? Would they forgive him? He thought of Earth, the city lights, the rivers of steel and glass, the laughter of his sister. He thought of the mistakes he had made, the career he had lost, the man he had been, and he realized something with a clarity that made his chest ache. He had already left Earth behind. He had left it the moment he stepped onto this moon, the moment he first touched the Aphesari vault. This was who he was now. This was what he was meant to become. He walked to the heart of the outpost, to the vault, where the Aphesari consciousness thrummed like a living star, and placed his hand upon the central sphere. "I'm ready," he whispered. The universe opened. The ascension. There was no pain, no fear, no struggle. His body dissolved into light, each atom unbound from the prison of flesh. His thoughts stretched outward, merging with the weave, expanding beyond anything he had ever known. He felt himself grow, not larger, but deeper, richer, more real. He was no longer limited by neurons or language or linear time. He could see the birth of stars and the death of galaxies in the same instant. He could feel the pulse of consciousness across the cosmos. He could speak in 1,000 tongues and listen to 1,000 more, all at once. And yet, impossibly, he was still Silas. He remembered Earth. He remembered his sister's laugh. He remembered the sting of failure and the sweetness of discovery. The Aphesari had been right. Individuality did not need to be lost. It could be preserved, cherished, even as it became part of something infinitely greater. And in that moment, Silas Marrow ceased to be merely human. He became a bridge, not just between species, but between eras, between the finite and the infinite, between the past and the future. 10 years later, when the Terran Exploration Corps returned to ATH Sheet 12 a decade later, they found the outpost alive. The once dark corridors now glowed with soft, pulsating light. Vast new structures, neither fully alien nor entirely human, had sprouted from the dome, stretching toward the violet sky. There was no sign of Silas Marrow, but strange transmissions pulsed from the outpost, carrying data encoded in both human and Aphesari syntax. The information was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered, a blueprint for technology centuries beyond their own, an invitation written in the universal language of thought. And within that signal, hidden in the lattice of code, a single message repeated again and again: "I did not come here to hide. I came here to become."